We're a go. Hi, Kev.
Hey, Boyd.
Hey, everybody.
Good to see you again.
Nice to see you. Kevin and I are here to talk a little bit about and I'll put it in quotation marks for a reason, the fall of Rome. Talking about the Edward Gibbon reading specifically, but then also talking a little bit more about this idea of falling. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, who I think had some questions, and we'll kind of see how this goes.
All right. Hey, everybody. So Boyd said a word, the word being fall. It's a loaded word. We'll get to that in a little bit. I'm going to try and share my screen.
Let's see what happens.
Let's see what happens.
There's something. Something's happening. There it is.
All right, good. So as not to... Don't look at my highlights, Boyd. I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
All right. So we're going to look at the Gibbon reading. And we often give you all primary sources to read. But the Gibbon text is not a primary source, correct, Boyd?
It is correct. It is not a primary source. He's writing in the Enlightenment, 18th century Europe.
Good. But that being said, this is still considered a really classic text at the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And I am going to ask Boyd some questions about this text. And as we're doing that, as we're looking at it together, and as I'm having this conversation with Boyd, we're going to kind of use it as a way to maybe learn about how to look at a secondary source historical text. So my first question, Boyd, is as you're reading through this, here's a really long introduction starting on page 92. Might be different for some of you at home. But anyway, and so as you look through the introduction, I wonder if you can pull out a thesis statement here.
Actually, yes. I wrote the word thesis. I don't know if you guys can see, very big, as I was reading. And actually on mine, it's page 93. It begins if you've got the hard copy.
Okay.
I have it here at the very bottom of the page. He writes in the paragraph that begins the rise of a city. But the decline of Rome was the natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness. Prosperity ripened the principle of decay. The causes of the destruction multiplied with the extent of conquest. And as soon as time or accident had removed the artificial supports, the stupendous fabric yielded to the pressure of its own weight.
I swear to God, people at home, Boyd and I did not talk about this ahead of time, and I highlighted the exact same thing.
Oh, yeah.
Either we are both geniuses or we're both wrong.
That's a toss-up.
But anyway, whatever the case may be, I agree that this appears to be a thesis statement here. And at the very least, it's an interesting statement. So let's break it down a little bit. It's a bold statement at the very least, right?
Yeah.
The decline of Rome was the natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness. What do you think that means, Boyd? Immoderate greatness.
I mean, it to me it sounds almost like he's saying they got too big for their britches, right? They not only grew physically in terms of the dimensions of the empire, but in terms of wealth, all of these things bring into mind, going back to the mandate of heaven. If you go back to China, right? The idea that once you get big and powerful, people tend to get lazy. Bad things start to happen, and that infrastructure starts to kind of crumble. That happened again. I'm using China as the example, but when the Chinese dynasties got so large that one person didn't feel like he could hold on, it was the people out in the outskirts that started to kind of rebel and take power and all that. So I think that idea of just becoming too big and great is not only about size, it's also about this idea of that feeling of being better than, of being superior to all others, tends to create issues internally that will eventually be problematic.
Good. Excellent. And there's he gets into a little bit more specific details as he goes through this paragraph, right? But there's another, the sentence right after is really interesting too, right? Instead of inquiring why the Roman Empire was destroyed, we should rather be surprised that it had subsisted so long. So that's interesting. And then he kind of goes from the universal to the particular. So if you wouldn't mind actually, if we go through more of the body of the Gibbon work here, could you talk a little bit and try to summarize as succinctly as possible, and then I can kind of scroll through on the screen. What were some of these reasons? And you touched on them already, I think, but what were some of the major reasons that Gibbon offers as far as why the Roman Empire did kind of fall under the weight, fall under its own weight? Can we kind of summarize these for
there's a couple, I guess, that I would point out. I'm trying to look as we do this. Sorry. I think there's a couple things. The first one, if you go to the next page, which is in line 94, the paragraph that begins the decay of Rome, right? I think there he talks, this is a little bit of the idea of the logistical problems of running a big empire. Those logistics caused the Romans to try to divide it administratively into an east and a west. And what Gibbon says is that, while sure, that might be a great thing to have less to run in terms of east and west, what ended up happening is the character of the West and the character, the culture, the language, all of that of the East were so different from one another that it was inevitable that this would create conflict instead of kind of administrative unity.
Very good.
I don't know if you have that on there somewhere.
I do. Yeah. Yep. I have that highlighted here. The decay of Rome has been frequently ascribed to the translation of the seat of the empire, but this history has also shown that the powers of government were divided rather than removed. And then it talks about the throne of Constantinople was erected in the east, while the west was still possessed by a series of empires, and talks about kind of the logistical problems as you referenced here. Very good, and maybe we'll revisit that. But what else? What are
under that? I was gonna say under that when he. It's funny. Gibbon actually gets a lot of flack for bashing Christianity a little bit, for saying Christianity is to blame. But I'll be honest with you. When I read this, I don't see him saying that. I think he sees Christianity as part of that. The Eastern Empire has a different culture than the West. But he's very careful to say here that, Christianity did have some role in this, but that people were suspect, or were what's the word I'm looking for here? People really had a lot of different superstitious ideas, and if it wasn't Christianity, something else would have filled this void, right? Like
he does choose his words carefully and chooses interesting choice of words there for sure.
If superstition had not afforded a decent retreat, the same vices would have tempted the unworthy Romans to desert from baser motives, the standard of the Republic. So the idea is, Christianity brought these new kind of moral values in there that drew people away from what it means to be Roman. But he says if Christianity hadn't done that, we would have found another reason to not be the same Roman we were.
Correct. And he says, regarding Christianity, though, he says, as the happiness of a future life is the great object of religion, we may hear without surprise or scandal that the introduction, or at least the abuse of Christianity, had some influence on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
The clergy successfully preached the doctrines of patience and pusillanimity. Good word that you'll probably see on the SAT or at least the GRE one day. The active virtues of society were discouraged, and the last remains of the military spirit were buried in the cloister.
And that's an
interesting one, right?
Yeah, that's the big one there. This idea that Rome was, and this is huge for Gibbon. The idea is that Rome was built on this military might, right? That part of what made Rome great was the expansion of the empire and this overwhelming military presence. You see this as early on as like the Aeneid, right? When they're in the underworld, one of the things that Aeneas sees is this line of soldiers and talks about the greatness of the Roman Empire there. And that's actually pretty gosh darn true. They're incredibly powerful. The problem is, and one of the problems I should say is, that Rome stops expanding at some point. And when you stop expanding, you no longer have that same kind of military zeal, all of that power. And so those people have to find other things to do. There tends to be, if you don't have an outward group to go fight, there tends to be more inward fighting, that infighting. So that idea of the Roman peace, the Pax Romana, which lasted for 150 years at the beginning of the empire, that is certainly not true of the second half of the Roman Empire. The second half of the Roman Empire is marked by fighting and fighting and fighting amongst the armies of Rome with one another. Yes, we're going to talk about the barbarians next. But,
all right. Yeah, let's go. Let's talk about the barbarians at the gates. Go for it.
I was going to say, because once you've got that kind of struggle internally, now all of a sudden there is a real external threat. And I want to talk a little bit about the barbarians, because people talk about the most famous, which is Attila the Hun, and he's, for good reason, given a lot of press about the impact he had. But the impact Attila had on the empire was less about Attila attacking the empire himself, although he does do that. What happens is the Huns. The Huns are a group from the east. Think Russia and further east, right? They come over into Europe, and all of these Germanic tribes, these groups, the Visigoths, the Goths, you'll see the names, the Vandals, all of these groups are not as strong as the Huns. So they are being driven out of their homes by the Huns. Well, there's nowhere else to go besides from their homes into Rome. And so what ends up happening is all of these different groups that start attacking the empire at once. And the military, which used to be able to put down, yay, there's an uprising in the east, let's send people over there and take care of it. They can't take care of all of this at once. We don't have that military anymore because, one, we haven't needed that military for a long time. And two, we've been fighting with each other for quite some time. And so when the barbarians show up, the Romans simply aren't prepared to take them on. And slowly but surely, you start to see victories for these barbarians. And eventually, Alaric, 476? Am I getting the right year? Somewhere near there, makes it into Rome itself and takes the city over. And at that point, you've got, I think one of the passages Kevin shared with me earlier was the Jerome passage that we'll talk about later.
Yeah. So, and I highlighted a couple passages from Gibbon to reinforce what Boyd was saying. The Romans were, this is right in section 1, beginning of section 1, the Romans were ignorant of the extent of their danger and the number of their enemies. Beyond the Rhine and the Danube, the northern countries of Europe and Asia were filled with innumerable tribes of hunters and shepherds, poor, voracious, and turbulent, bold in arms, and impatient to ravish the fruits of industry.
Oh, look at that.
The barbarian world was agitated by the rapid impulse of war, and the peace of Gaul or Italy was shaken by the distant revolutions of China. And then it talks about the Huns and many others through that passage. And then jumping down to 3, cold poverty and a life of danger and fatigue fortify the strength and courage of barbarians. In every age, they have oppressed the polite and peaceful nations of China, India, and Persia, who neglected and still neglect to counterbalance these natural powers by the resources of military art.
Yeah, this is the part where I get maybe a little frustrated with Gibbon. This is the idea of, oh, we are civilized, and people who aren't civilized want that, so they fight for it. And he finishes actually with a pretty good point at the end of what we read, where he says, those things that make us civilized, the technological growth and all of that, that's all well and good. But as soon as those people who are not civilized get it, we've lost our ability to fight them off. And so at the very end, he talks about, the loss of this kind of technological advancement, because, as he says, civilization marches forward, and even those uncivilized people are bound to become civilized.
Yeah, really interesting passage there. So I highlighted that for you all at home. And now, as we wrap up the reading of Gibbon, I want to actually revisit the thesis here. Let's see, did I scroll too high? Probably
92 in yours, I think you said.
Yeah, and just to kind of wrap it up. So again, just in an effort to kind of help approach a reading like this, so it can seem kind of overwhelming, I think, but you can break it down into chunks, kind of like Boyd and I just did, where you can look for the thesis. Whenever you get something like this, I do recommend find the thesis statement, which is what Boyd did, and I think him and I agree on the thesis here. And then look for these topics and these assertion sentences, which is what we ask for you all to do in your papers. You'll find them in academic writing too, obviously, because that's what we're hopefully training you to do as well. But revisiting that paragraph that we started with, the rise of the city swelled into an empire. Look back, and then I'm going to highlight something else, which I didn't initially, and you can kind of see where he's going with this whole excerpt that we gave you. After the story of its ruin, then he starts to get into more specifics. The emperors, anxious for their personal safety and the public peace, were reduced to the base expedient of corrupting the discipline, which rendered them alike formidable to their sovereign and to the enemy. The vigor of the military government was relaxed and finally dissolved by the partial institutions of Constantine, and the Roman world was overwhelmed by a deluge of barbarians, right? And then he goes through to expound on those things, right? And gives more.
How about that?
So that can help you kind of break down this reading and learn more about what specifics he believes went into the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Now, Boyd, one last question here. Why do we care?
Yeah.
So beyond wanting to learn about Rome, because we're learning about Rome, why do people continue to read Gibbon? And so you said actually that you had some problems with him, which is interesting. It's an interesting thing to say, yeah. Which would suggest that he's presenting some opinions. So why do we read a work like this?
This is a good question. I think we read this because this is the process we have seen time and time again. In every civilization we've talked about, there has been a, whether you call it a fall or what, a transition from one mode to another. I like to use China just because I think it's the easiest one to see it in, where you have strong centralized government followed by a period of decentralization, followed by strong centralized government, followed by decentralization, right? It happens over and over and over again. Different reasons. In a place like China, it's interesting because the culture stays pretty gosh darn similar through those political changes, right? So no one ever talks about China as the fall of China during that time, because culturally, even when the political regime changes, it stays conservative internally. Whereas something like Rome is a little more challenging. I think it's a lot more complex because you have within the period of what we would call before the fall, you have some major cultural changes, including Christianity, but not exclusively Christianity, happening there. So that by the end, by 476, a lot of what is happening within the empire itself would be so different from, say, the time of Augustus. So in some ways, you could say by 476, by the time Rome fell, it was no longer the same civilization as it was, to begin with. It was a whole different thing. But at the same time, you could also make the argument that no civilization stays static, that there's always some change one way or the other. And even whenever the city falls, this is like the law of conservation of energy. It doesn't end Rome. What it does is transition Rome into something else that we end up calling the medieval period. And that eventually will also transition into something that we call the early monarchies. And that will transition into something that we call, the idea of democracy again. So that in some way, maybe there is no fall in that sense. Boy, I rambled. I don't know if that made sense.
It absolutely does. And I'm going to say one last thing about Gibbon, and then put you on the spot.
Okay.
And ask for your opinion on something. So regarding Gibbon, I'd like for you all at home to look for these interesting sentences that reveal his personal opinions, right? And you don't have to agree with them, right? It's these kind of sentences of insight that he offers as a historian, and this is where I think the reading of history becomes one where we can constantly debate, right? And where really well-respected historians can disagree on things, and that it's this constant conversation. And I have one here under the section about Constantinople. He has this line here that can get lost, but it's really interesting to me. Extreme distress, which unites the virtue of a free people, embitters the factions of a declining monarchy. So Boyd, if you remove that line from the context here, does that have anything to do with Rome, or would you know that has anything to do with Rome?
No, I mean that's the kind of thing that you see again with all these civilizations. When you, this idea that some things, when we all have a stake in the government or in the society, some things, an outside threat or whatever else, brings us together to fight together for it. Whereas that same kind of distress, when we feel like we don't have a voice, when we're the peasantry, whatever else, that might get us to turn against our leader and cause division, right? And that can happen anywhere.
Right. And this is, I think, this is the type of stuff that people who throw their life away to study history, like Boyd and me, we find fascinating, I think, to constantly debate about. And even things like what we talked about, like, as the happiness of a future life is the great object of religion, we may hear without surprise or scandal that the introduction, or at least the abuse of Christianity, had some influence on the decline or fall of the Roman Empire. So that is Roman Empire specific, but you could generalize that idea and apply it in other eras in history, or perhaps the present, right?
Yep.
Or even the way that this passage ends, or this whole reading ends. I mean, it's full of insights that you don't necessarily have to agree with, but I think are at least interesting. So finally, I will put you on the spot now. Okay. And so you've been talking about the decline and potential fall here of this particular empire. And you did talk about how the idea that this maybe just changed into something else, namely the medieval era of Europe, period of Europe. So I will ask for your opinion. Well, was there a fall of the Roman Empire? Or you could answer another question, which is, how do you mark a fall of a great empire? Is there something we should look for? Is there a clear characteristic? How do we discuss the fall of a particular empire like Rome, or any empire for that matter?
You know, it's funny. For Rome, I feel like I have an idea of how I've done this, and I don't know if this is good history or not. But for me, once the Tetrarchy begins, and really, for those of you who don't remember, that's the division in the East-West begins, and the wars that follow eventually establish Constantinople as the center of the empire. To me, that marks something new. Less because of the administrative, I mean, the emperor still has the same kind of theoretical power. There's still a Senate, all of that. But this is the part where I actually agree with Gibbon, that the cultural differences between East and West were pretty significant. The language of the East was different. The beginnings of Christianity, if I had my druthers, I'd say after 325. So we have the official Christianity as part of the empire, maybe even 380, I think, when it becomes the only legal religion. I think that at that moment, the Roman Empire, the way I have defined it, has subsided. And then something new has begun that I think we would call Byzantium eventually. But I think that Constantine is more the beginning of Byzantium than he is a continuation of Rome, if that makes sense. And so I think for my purposes, that's the way I've looked at it, knowing that in the West then we have this, okay, if that doesn't really exist in that same way, what's happening? And I think that's where we have our transition happening towards a more feudal society. And it doesn't happen overnight. You don't go from, hey, we're the empire to now we're feudalism. There's 150 years of transition and fighting and whatever else until we can kind of come out of it and see something that we might call feudalism. Is that an acceptable answer?
Absolutely. Very good. Once again, we have talked way too long. Nobody is watching us anymore. We should probably end this conversation here.
Let me at least stop the recording right now. Thanks, guys.